Life gets busy. Some of us are juggling work, relationships, our health and well-being, caring for others, and sometimes studying as well. And trying to stay grounded in the middle of this all, it's not easy. But in this video, I'm sharing habits that have truly helped me, backed by psychology and cognitive neuroscience. Hi, I'm Leona. I study psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and public health. I've worked in world-leading investment banks and media companies, so I completely understand how busy life can actually become. Let's get into this video. So here's something surprising. Even brief moments of distraction can leave a mark on our brain's ability to focus. And that's not just a productivity issue. Honestly, it's a biological one. So the concept called goal interference theory, which basically shows that when we attempt to juggle too many unrelated tasks, each goal competes for neural resources. So the anterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain that helps detect, for example, conflict and shift attention, often becomes overloaded trying to basically manage these transitions. So this can leave us feeling mentally scattered or unfocused, even if we're basically technically still working. So psychologists also talk about attention residue, right? Which basically means it's a mental hangover we get when our brain hasn't fully let go of one task before starting another one. So that's why we can feel scattered even during calm moments. So part of our mind is still stuck on something from earlier. Okay, cool. So what actually helps? So creating mental anchors that basically could mean setting, for example, a 30-minute timer where we do just one task, whether it's working, reading, or planning, and then taking like a short break to reset. So we can also build simpler cues that train our brain, for example, like drinking water before studying or starting work. So for me, having a clear start and stop routine makes a huge difference. Even the act of closing tabs, for example, reading the Bible or stretching before a new task signals to my brain, no, we're actually shifting gears now. So the truth is, focus doesn't have to be forced. When we reduce internal conflict and give the brain clarity, time feels calmer, and so do we. So that's how I manage my time in a way that actually works for my brain and my lifestyle. Okay, so tip number 2 is use time blocking to work with the brain's reward system. So one thing that's completely changed the way I manage my time is basically treating it more like an energy budget than a to-do list. And one of the most helpful tools for that has been time blocking. So not in a rigid way, but in a way that works with how my brain stays focused. So this ties nicely into something called dopaminergic salience. So this is basically the brain's reward system, especially areas like the ventral striatum really responds when things feel clean, a little bit new and generally doable. So instead of setting vague goals like, oh, I'll work on this today, we can get more specific about when and how we'll do it. So researchers call this temporal structuring, which basically is the idea that breaking our day into defined chunks actually helps the brain manage attention and motivation more easily. So for me, this could look like breaking up my day into manageable and often like memorable blocks. So for example, this could be like creative work in the morning, and then I'll do admin work mid-morning, and then I'll run my errands in the evening. So each block has a soft start and gentle stop. And if I don't finish everything, that's completely okay, because the point isn't to be perfect here. It's basically to create a rhythm the brain can actually just lean into. So this habit isn't just about productivity, it's about how I keep my time grounded and sustainable. So what helps most is literally remembering this. When our brain has rhythm, our brain has less to fight against. And even small wins, honestly, it starts to feel more meaningful. Okay, so this next habit is basically anchoring tasks into small familiar cues. So there's a small habit I use that makes big tasks honestly less intimidating. I pair this with something familiar, and the reason it works isn't just emotional, it's neurological. So our brain loves association. The basal ganglia, a region tied to habit formation, becomes more efficient when, for example, it can add new behaviors into existing patterns. So when we combine a new task with something already familiar, the brain sees it as one routine instead of two separate efforts. So instead of saying, oh, I need to sit down and write, we might say something like, okay, after I make my herbal tea, I'll open my laptop and do at least 10 minutes. So this cue becomes the anchor, and honestly, our resistance just drops. For me, I sometimes listen to a sermon before I start writing my scripts or my content. The moment I finish my routine, my brain knows, okay, cool, we're now going to focus. It's like flipping a mental switch without the stress. To be completely honest, we don't actually need more motivation. I think what we really just need is to build more anchors that basically tell the brain that this is the next step. So something else I do is basically protect unscheduled time as a brain reset zone. So one of the best time habits I've learned is also the simplest, and this is leave room to breathe. Building time when nothing is booked and protects it like honestly any other priority. So this ties into the brain's default mode network, the part of the brain that activates when we're not doing anything in particular. It's linked to things like self-reflection, problem solving, and switch creative insight. So when we overschedule, this network doesn't get enough activation, and that can leave us feeling stuck even when we think we're being productive. So psychologically, it's those unstructured moments where integration happens. It's when we actually make sense of things. So emotionally, mentally, spiritually, it allows for just that quiet reset. So whether it's a no meeting morning, for example, or even a walk like in a park on a Sunday evening when you have nothing planned, building that pause just matters. So for me, often on like a Sunday evening, I just keep them sacred. I slow down, I take my time, I just enjoy the day and relax. So the brain needs rest to function at its best, not just sleep, but actual space. And giving ourselves that is one of the most powerful ways to literally honor our time. So next is basically creating a deadline to trigger focus. Some of us wait until the last minute to start. Honestly, it's not because we're lazy, but because basically urgency can sometimes be a powerful motivator to act, and that's actually a brain response. When a deadline approaches, for example, a part of the brain responsible for alertness ramps up and helps us focus. It triggers a chain reaction that sharpens our attention and strengthens our memory, and this basically helps us think more clearly under pressure. So that's why sometimes many of us can potentially feel sharper when we know there's a deadline. But living in constant urgency just isn't sustainable, trust me. So one way to work with this system, basically without burning out, is to really create our own mini deadlines. So the Parkinson's law effect shows that work expands to fill the time we give it. So shorter timelines often lead to sharper results, for example, because we're more focused to get to the point. So for example, setting like an hour timer to finish part of a project, or telling ourselves, actually, I'll complete this before lunch or dinner. So shorter timelines often lead to sharper results because we're forced to actually just get to the point. Personally, I use this concept when I'm recording my content, right? I'll set a specific time window and just say, okay, this is the time I've given myself to actually record, and just go over it. So not massive pressure to finish everything, but enough structure to basically activate the focus mode. This honestly is how I manage my time without burning out. If you take one thing away from this point, literally take this: urgency doesn't have to come from panic. It can come from purpose, and small deadlines can honestly help us show up without the burnout. But on to the next point: make the most of life's in-between moments. We often treat transition moments like waiting in line or walking to the store, for example, the station, as dead time, but the brain sees it differently. So these in-between moments are when the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex actually quietly organize information, reflect on recent events, and basically just prime us for what's next, only if we allow them to. If we constantly fill those gaps with scrolling, we're basically robbing our brain of a natural reset. Psychologists call this liminal space, which means that time that feels empty but actually holds the power to prepare us. So when we reclaim it, we become more intentional. We slow down just enough to let clarity in. It could be as simple as walking without headphones, or just letting our mind wander while washing the dishes, for example, packing a dishwasher. So for me, those in-between moments have literally become where some of my best decisions surface. So those small pauses in life, especially when we're busy, it's not wasted time. They're where we reconnect, and they help us show up to the next moment with more peace. There are days when we plan to be focused and it just doesn't happen, let's be honest. We scroll, procrastinate, or even get stuck in our heads. But instead of seeing that as failure, we can use it as feedback. So in psychology, this connects to self-regulation theory, which looks at how we monitor our behavior against our goals. So when we miss the mark, for example, the brain doesn't need shame, it needs clarity. The real questions become, okay, what actually interrupted our follow through in the first place? Maybe it was tiredness or emotional overload. It could have been anything. Or maybe the task just felt vague or like really underwhelming. So all of those are basically clues, right? So when we treat those gaps like data, we get better at anticipating the next time. So for me, I've definitely learned to track not just what I did, but what I avoided and why. So it's not about judgment. It's basically more about building a kind relationship with our time. So this has been a game changer in how I manage my time effectively. So also when you miss plans don't mean we're undisciplined. They mean we're human, and with awareness, they can help us build something better. Okay, so it's easy to rush through the week without asking, what am I even doing? And why am I doing this? But the brain is more focused and resilient when our actions actually connect to something meaningful. So this actually links nicely with the concept of self-determination theory, which basically shows that we're more motivated when our goals align with personal values. So cognitive neuroscience also supports this, right? So the medial prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain that integrates self-awareness and decision-making, becomes more active when we reflect on what matters to us. So instead of just managing, for example, our time around tasks, we can really just filter our week through values. So am I making space for connection, for rest, for creativity? That shift alone changes how our brain evaluates rewards and uses energy. It's one of the way I literally stay intentional about how I manage my time. So for me, Sundays really help with this reset. I can pray, reflect on what I want my time to reflect, not just my schedule, but literally my spirit. When our time flows from our values, we stop chasing, right? And we start living with deeper clarity. So to be honest, most of us give our best energy to everything and everyone else, but time that feels like ours, that often gets pushed to the side or isn't even really prioritized on our to-do list. So in psychology, this connects to the ego depletion theory, right? And that's the idea that self-control is like a battery. It drains as the day goes on, but having time for autonomy, for example, when no one actually needs us and we're not on pretty much, helps recharge the battery. This doesn't have to be a whole evening, even 30 minutes of protected time for journaling or walking or just being quiet. Honestly, it tells the brain, no, we matter too. It's not self-indulgent, it's emotional maintenance. Psychology really shifted how I approach my time. This point is a good example. Pretty much my quiet time, right, that I select for the day doesn't really have no agenda. No, wait, actually, I'll sometimes read a Bible scripture, but honestly, that protected time feels sacred. They don't always look productive, but they help me show up better. The peace isn't passive, it's something we protect. And basically, even a little bit of time to ourselves can shift how the whole week just feels. Okay, so something in the long term to basically adopt is basically track progress more than productivity. So we could often measure time by how much we get done, right? But what if we actually tracked what really matters? So like calm, courage, or presence. So psychologists basically call this self-concordant goal setting. This means choosing goals that align with our deeper self, right? So not just surface tasks. So when we track our progress through that lens, we basically create space for growth that actually feels good. For example, instead of only listing tasks completed, we could ask stuff like, hold on, when did I feel grounded this week? When did I actually handle something better than I would have done before? And when did I actually show up fully? So these moments might not show up in a planner, for example, but they're the ones that really shift how we experience time. The progress definitely isn't always visible, but if we track it with the right lens, we'll basically realize that we're moving forward in the ways that actually matter and that we're using our time effectively. Okay, so to be honest, there are times I do all the planning and still feel overwhelmed by how much I have to do. And I found that when this happens, literally just to pause and remind myself, actually, Leon, you're not doing all of this alone. So as a Christian, I see time as something I'm stewarding, right? So not just filling. The one small habit that I think I'll be doing much more of in the future is basically just inviting Christ into my week. So that might look like a quiet moment of prayer over my planner and just saying, God, help me focus on what actually matters. It brings a calm that literally no checklist can give me. So neuroscience actually backs this up. So studies show that prayer and similar reflexive practices basically activate areas of the brain linked to emotional balance and long-term thinking. So like the default mode network and, for example, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And if faith isn't your thing, the principle still applies. So setting an intention before the week begins, even something like journaling or, a deep breath or something meaningful, it can still bring some grounding. It gives the brain sense of focus and peace, that sometimes people can miss when we're rushing around trying to get everything done. The goal isn't to control every hour, it's to live your season with intention, right? Grounded in whatever brings you peace and focus whilst you're trying to manage everything else during that time. Okay, so those are some of the habits that have genuinely helped me manage my time more effectively, backed by psychology and cognitive neuroscience. If you found this video useful, check out the other content on my channel, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Bye.